Welcome back to Centennial Conversations, a series of podcasts about the first 100 years of Gavilan College. I'm Doug Achterman, head librarian at Gavilan, and we're here with history professor Leah Halper, author of To Dream on Your Behalf, A History of Gavilan College. So in our last conversation, we talked about the changes that came to Gavilan in the 1970s, social changes, changes in the student population, in the mission of the college, changes in the leadership, even changes in the success of our football team.
Yes.
So in the 1980s, Gavilan really grappled with some significant external challenges. What were some of those?
Well, the first one that has to be foremost is Prop 13, which voters passed in 1978 and which greatly affected the revenues for basically every public agency, but community colleges and Gavilan in particular were very, very, very hard hit. The college lost 60% of its revenue and had to keep serving students. And in fact, in the decade that followed, the revenue stayed down, but the enrollments went up, 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 up. So Gavilan was literally doing more with less. So, where do you cut? They phased out vocational education programs. They cut classified staff, which is always painful in so many ways. And there were pretty deep cuts to sports. So this program that had been so vibrant in the 1970s really took some hits. And then the state level response was to, for the first time in the community college system since the beginning, 60 years before, the state said, well, you can charge tuition now. And to their credit, the Gavilan trustees, conservative old farmers and ranchers, they really resisted. They really didn't want to charge tuition. Other colleges were rushing to, say, okay, this is how much it costs now. But Gavilan really held out. And then in the fall of 1983, tuition was charged for the first time. And there's a faculty analysis from about 10 years later, and it points out that the cuts were to the usual suspects, right? They cut the humanities, they cut science, they cut social science. Student population doubled. So the statistics I found in this report were in 73 to 74, there were 119 sections offered. And population, meanwhile, doubled by 1980-81. But that year there were only 96 sections offered. So it was a pretty significant. Chicano studies disappeared. They cut econ, history, literature classes. It took a huge toll.
So I'm sure the size of the classes went up and the number of sections went down. The enrollment was going up, but we were cutting. So that's kind of a bad combination.
Terrible and, extremely stressful for the faculty and for everybody. I mean, the classified staff had to pick up, double workload when somebody left. The work still had to get done.
I think I remember reading in your history that the classified staff was cut something like 20% at that time.
It was significant, and a lot of the old-time classified staffers who had come over from San Benito College and who enjoyed a kind of camaraderie in a workplace that was really warm and supportive, they just retired. That was it for them. They didn't want to stay and see this. You can't blame them.
And President Malone, he retired too. Why did he retire?
It had to take a toll on Rudy Malone. It took a toll on everybody, and he was really the heart and soul of this college. And to see it contract, and to see he had worked so hard to establish harmony and good relationships, and then to see it go up in smoke, it must have been very disheartening. And his health began to decline. He suffered macular degeneration, and he slowly went blind. And he retired in 1985 and actually had a wonderful, fourth act. His wife had negotiated that they would move to San Francisco, and he happened past something called, I think it's now called the Saybrook University, but it was an institute at that time. And he ended up working there part-time, and they quickly realized what a complete jewel he was. So he ended up serving as their acting president. He wasn't quite done with being presidential, and really helping kind of define and amplify the institution, despite his, I think by then, total blindness. And he was, or at least near blindness. So he had a nice second act, but relationships had really deteriorated. In hard times, it's, I think, very easy to turn on each other.
Yeah. And then who replaced him?
A marine biologist named John Holloman, who came from Vista College in Oakland. And he came right as the community college system started to recover. With more enrollments, finally the college started to get more state funding, so there was a little bit of fiscal growth. And he was very savvy financially. He built up a huge financial reserve. And unfortunately, there was a recession in the late 80s, and so that reserve got spent. But he's there until, I think, 92 or 93. So John Holloman and I overlapped a little bit. So I actually have a memory of John Holloman.
And so with all of this fiscal challenge and changes in leadership, how did the faculty respond to all the change that was going on?
Good question. I think in some ways people really pulled together. I think there was a sense of solidarity. I think the union was increasingly active because it had to be, and a kind of us versus them mentality kind of developed. The union developed a team of guys, because I think they were pretty much all guys except maybe Susan Oliveira, who were tough negotiators and who kind of held the line for the faculty. And so, they socialized together. They had something called Grims. They would go on, was it a Friday night, I think, or a Thursday night at the end of the week, and they'd all go drink together. And apparently, there was a lot of solidarity. And I think relationship with the board and the administrators was in many ways more fraught. They would negotiate on everything, and it didn't lead to particularly harmonious relations.
Were there good changes?
Yeah, in fact, one that I think we really have to mention. Through the Gilroy Historical Society, people in town, including, I think, Alan Porcella, who was interested in all things historical because he had deep roots in Gilroy. His grandfather, I think, had a local Italian band that played at a lot of events. The Historical Society had an old virgin redwood house built from redwoods off of Hecker Pass in the 1860s or 70s called Mayock House. It was named for a local doctor. And it was threatened with complete destruction because Highway 101 was being built and it happened to be in the pathway and it was going to be killed. So the Historical Society, I think at that time, owned it and sold it to the college union for $1. And then somebody knew somebody who knew somebody who did a $10,000 donation, basically, of in-kind services by putting it up on a truck and hauling it to the college. And the college put aside a little grassy spot at the top of the northern parking lot. And they plunked it down there, and it was in terrible shape. But there were a number of faculty who had not only construction skills, but fine carpentry skills, which is a little different. I mean, that's a whole world of beautiful finishing and joinery. And so there was also a construction technology program, and it became this wonderful, in fact, I've often thought if only we had a Mayock House project, wonderful way to bring people together after school and on Saturdays. Everybody came, everybody participated. They got to know each other by working shoulder to shoulder instead of sitting across the table, talking, which academics love to do. And, everybody gave something. Some people sanded the beautiful, curving, sweeping wooden banisters, and some people painted. And they just restored it to a beautiful space for faculty. And it became a place where you could go eat your lunch, you could have a little meeting, you could do interviews with incoming faculty and impress the hell out of them because it was beautifully decorated with period furniture, and it was just a sanctuary. Unfortunately, it was not earthquake safe, and so for many years it was used by faculty when I guess I've heard later that it should not have been, but it was wonderful to have. And at some point when I was union president, Marlene Dwyer and I went to San Francisco and bought beautiful silver-plated silverware and nice white plates and a lot of cooking utensils so that we could cook there and, have parties. And it was just a wonderful place. And it's been closed for a couple of years. I'm hoping that there's some way we can find to restore it. It's not earthquake safe, and it's going to take a lot of money to bring it up to state standards. But that was one positive. Another positive was the founding of the ESL program. The first class that I could find was offered in 1973, and it was Georgette Paris Smith, that wonderful feminist activist whose protege was Tony Ruiz, who had been one of her students and who came back to teach Spanish. And they co-taught the first ESL class, again, that I could find, and suggested that the college could really expand this. So in fall of 74, it was begun as a new program. Alan Porcella was a full-time hire. There was an aide hired to kind of help students practice. And that was a real positive because so many people in this community have found a path to integration and to more successful lives through this program at Gavilan, which provided much more than language instruction. It provided lots of acculturation services, legal referrals, like all sorts of information about how to live here. The reentry program maybe is one other thing that's a positive that I should mention. Divorce isn't new in U.S. history, but the divorce rates skyrocketed in the 60s and 70s during the women's liberation movement that kind of, made the point, why are you staying in this marriage where you're completely unhappy? Maybe you have something to contribute to the world that you could do if you don't want to stay in this marriage. So the reentry program was specifically founded for, I think they could say at that time that it was for women who were 40 and older or reentering the job market and needing academic and occupational skills. And so, again, so many women found refuge in this program. It was so supportive. They established such a great rapport with the counselors and the teachers, and it won national recognition. It was really a wraparound program that was very successful. They offered childcare, and women could go to school without worrying about, how they were going to make ends meet because financial aid was part of this.
And I would say that that AB 1725 would be another positive change that was going on, kind of a major piece of legislation that transformed community colleges in California.
It certainly did, and we're still in process. I mean, that's what's often known as the shared governance legislation that recognized college faculty as partners with the district in running community colleges. And it also, I need to say, it established seats at the table for classified staff and students so that everybody's working together. And it really strengthened faculty senates. It gave them a lot of power. It was trying to kind of increase money for community colleges so that there would be a more unified system and better articulation. And it impacted tenure. It also set some goals, famously one that we're nowhere near meeting and probably will never meet, the 75-25 goal to have 75% full-time faculty and 25% part-time faculty. Not that there's any difference in quality of qualification or teaching, but full-time faculty don't rush off to their next job. They can stay and join a committee and, make more contributions simply because they have the security and the stability to hang around a little more. So we haven't reached that, but it was a goal for a long time.
In the most recent data from the state, we're 30% below that goal right now. We're at 45%.
Yeah, I wonder how that's changed. I don't have statistics from 1978 when it passed, but it would be interesting to find out. But it's had a big impact on Gavilan.
So part of the 80s really includes then figuring out how to provide more services and be more inclusive of different kinds of populations, women who are older returning to college. But also there was the formulation of this Hispanic Advisory Committee that I'm thinking must have been toward that goal as well.
It was. And here's where the interview that I did with John Perez was very helpful, because he was a Gavilan student who then went away, worked extremely hard, got his dental degree, and then really only ever wanted to come back and practice dentistry in Gilroy, where he faced barriers, discrimination. But he persevered, and once he was established, his wife Rachel, of course, also working in this community, contributing as a teacher and then as an administrator in the local school district, he turned his sights back to where they had been in high school and to some degree in college, and started looking at the structuring of denial of opportunity to local Spanish surname, Chicano, Mexican-American students, and became one of several Chicano activists or Latino activists who started watching the college, because the college really is a place to look if you want people to get opportunities that they have hitherto been denied. So eventually this group started a Hispanic Advisory Committee. They were disturbed by dropout rates at the high school. They were disturbed by what they saw as, education that wasn't really relevant. A lot of the Chicano programs that had been founded at Gavilan, the classes and, the clubs and so forth, foundered after Prop 13, like a lot of other things. And they were as necessary as ever, but they weren't funded, and they didn't have advocates, and there wasn't presence at the college. The leadership was mostly white, not reflecting the local community, which is important. When students come here, they look around, and if they don't see anybody who looks like them, that's a certain message about what they're capable of and who's in charge. So this committee played a really positive role, and also I think helped elect John Perez to the Board of Trustees, I think in 1980. I don't have the number in front of me. It might have been in 84. Anyway, he was the graduation speaker right before, in May, and then an opening came up on the board, and he was appointed, and then he ran for the seat and won. And when I came to Gavilan in 1990, faculty who had no reason to like John Perez or to feel warmly towards him, completely different worlds, told me, this is the best board member we have ever had. This man did his work. So he was an advocate not narrowly for, one community, but he advocated for students, and he also advocated for transparency in how the college did things. There's a 1950s mentality. They shut the doors, they lit their cigars, and they made their decisions. And that's against California law. The Brown Act says you can't do it that way, but they persisted in doing it that way. And there were some hiring processes that John Perez, he did some very brave things. He went to the newspaper and said they're breaking the law. And so I think probably his fellow board members perceived him as a renegade and a heretic. And, but the guy worked so hard. And, he was the one who had knowledgeable questions about the budget that everybody else had just kind of glanced at, that he couldn't be dismissed. He made an impact, and he interrupted a lot of bad, secret, old boy processes that had been in place for a really long time.
At the end of the 80s, we had this major event, a geological event. I had moved away from the Bay Area at that point. I was living in Southern California, but I realized coming to Gavilan that the 1989 earthquake was actually very close in distance. The epicenter was very close to Gavilan College. What impact did the Loma Prieta earthquake have on this college?
It had a huge impact. Remember that a lot of the buildings are the classic unreinforced concrete that is supposed to just go right down. So I walk around thinking, God, why is this building still up? Including the two buildings that I use the most are in that category. It happened at 5 p.m, so there weren't a lot of people on campus. Nothing actually fell down on campus that I know of. But the shaking was pretty violent in that earthquake, and then the aftershocks were pretty bad. And people who were here tell a funny story. They were being convinced by administrators. They were all called into a room. In those days, you could get everybody on campus at the same time, and they were being lectured, there's no danger, everything's fine, you're all to go back to your classes. And there was an enormous aftershock as this was being said, and everybody just turned their backs and walked out, where they were safe. They were out on the grass. So the earthquake, of course, had a huge impact on California. Earthquake standards improved, and you have earthquake drills now. It didn't actually hurt the college, but it apparently really shook things here.
Okay. And so moving into the 90s, then in the sort of mid 90s, 1994, there was a hugely memorable event for anyone who went through it. What happened at that point?
I'm going to give the short version because, honestly, this starts to intersect with my role as a faculty person, which is different from my role as a historian. And, historians talk about how much to insert oneself into the history. There's the old school classic, try to be objective, as if there could be such a thing. But I am very aware that my experience of these events really colors how I talk about them. So I think we're going to do a whole separate session just on these events. But I'll give you a thumbnail sketch that's probably pretty objective or pretty factual, at least. Prop 13 just set in motion all of these financial problems. And there was a period of some recovery in the 80s, and then there was a recession in the late 80s. And John Holloman, who was very good with money, spent down the reserve. And then faculty were unhappy with him for a number of reasons, and he was not feeling so welcome, so he retired. And unbeknownst to most people, I think maybe including some of the board members, the college was in bad shape financially. And so the next president, Glenn Maley, came in and found out in his first week how bad it was. And Kent Child says he wouldn't have taken the job if he had known that. And it was pretty seriously crisis time. And so here's where I come in. I mean, I remember this really, really clearly. At a professional learning day in the fall, he stood up and he gave us very bad news and said that he was probably going to have to lay people off. So I've been there 4 years. I have tenure by now. I'm a journalist by background. Nobody intimidates me. So I raised my hand and I said, are you going to follow a shared governance practice? Because I had been, well trained by my faculty mentors in AB 1725 and shared governance, and I knew that he was supposed to. And his reaction was kind of prophetic. He reddened, he stammered, he became extremely angry. And he said, do you want to make the decisions about who gets laid off? So I'm a feminist. Again, you don't intimidate me. So I said, well, no, I don't want to make the decisions, but I think a staff and faculty committee should be involved. Nobody's going to get the last word on me. So after that meeting, people came to talk to me and said, I'm so glad you asked that question, and how's he going to do this? And this is terrible. And it just went downhill from there. He was never a good cultural fit from the college. He was from a more conservative background from the South and had trouble just dealing with California and the diversity, I think. But he also was pushed into corners that were just awful. And the faculty senate really was sidelined. People today get angry when they feel like they haven't been consulted or the administrators are doing something that, they didn't talk to the Senate. I have seen what it looks like when shared governance is completely and willfully ignored. And I can tell you that we've seen nothing like it since. And so the staff, especially the classified staff, some very strong classified staffers, some in the business department, all of whom were laid off. They were targeted. And the faculty and some really great students who were I'm really proud of these students. They got together and they put together an alternative budget that would require no layoffs. It would require cuts, but these women knew where to cut. I mean, they knew the budget. They're the ones who prepared the budget. So they presented a really viable alternative. But things were so polarized. There was a terrible board meeting. And things were so polarized that on the advice of Glenn Maley, the board heard the proposal and said, thank you very much. Now, who will make a move to approve Dr. Maley's proposal? And I'll never forget this moment. It was the biggest board meeting I've ever been to. Back in those days, you went to the board meetings sometimes because, stuff, it was a smaller place and stuff interested you and you wanted to go see how somebody was going to vote. So it was packed. And all of the board members, except the student trustee, voted for Dr. Maley's proposal. And when the student trustee voted no, her name was Jenny Coppins. She was a student of mine. I was so proud. The room erupted. All the classified staff, many of whom were about to lose their jobs, said thank you. People were crying. It was quite a moment. It was very. So that's the setup. And then what happened after that was really ugly.
That's the setup.
Yeah. What happened after was really awful. And again, trying to make the long story short, people were laid off, and people with more seniority could bump people with less seniority. So sometimes 4 or 5 people were affected by one person being laid off. Somehow they contrived to get rid of all the women who were the main classified staff union power, and also they happened to pretty much be the people who worked in the business office and were the analysts and the budget preparers. I don't know how they did that without allowing them to bump into other positions, but they decapitated the classified staff union, and it was a hard place to work. I remember going to my box, and I had been involved, and I was young, and I had lots of energy, and I had all these ideas and projects, and I just felt like this is not a place where I want to give my time. This is not. There was a cartoon that was put in our boxes, and it showed a medieval executioner, and he had a whip, and he had one of those things that chops off heads, and the caption said, "The beatings will stop when morale improves." And that's how it felt.
So you were teaching here then, and so what was that? What was it like then? What was the experience for faculty at that point? You talked about the difficulty and the low morale. What else can you say about the faculty experience at that time?
Interestingly, faculty were not cut. So there was this sense of privilege, unearned, that the classified staff was really targeted. And, some programs were trimmed here and there, but it was really the classified staff. So Art Junker, who was a famous music teacher, worked here for many, many years. He was the faculty senate president. And his metaphor was Kristallnacht. They've come for some of the Jews, and the rest of us are wondering, are we next? And it just felt so violent the way that it was done. It was really really painful. So everybody kind of retreated into their teaching, I think. People didn't really make a lot of contributions in that period. And then Glenn Maley left.
And is that pretty much but that didn't resolve the crisis, right? I mean, there must have been other things that helped resolve that. I'm sure that was a factor, but what else helped resolve that crisis?
Well, the college put itself on a pretty strict diet financially, and the Glenn Maley's dean of that in those days we said dean of instruction instead of vice president. It was Rosemary Joyce, and she became the interim and then the college president. And her whole approach was to try to heal. And she had a kind of unique background for that. She had been a nun until she was, I think, well into her 20s, and she married a priest. And so she had a whole spiritual side that sometimes showed. I know she was controversial. She had her likes and dislikes, and sometimes she could be kind of unfair. But I think she also really loved the college and really cared about it, and made some rules right from the beginning, i.e. the first rule was there will be no more layoffs. We will do what we need to do to balance our budget and to get through, but we will not lay off other people. There will be attrition, and we'll work with that, but no layoffs, which was extraordinarily reassuring because I can't tell you how deeply the scars go. I still get choked up, and it's, 25 years later,
Mm-hmm.
when I think about some of those women in the business office and how brave they were, and how they lost their jobs as a result. So she made some rules and established a president's council that was more collaborative, showed that she cared about shared governance. She could be arbitrary and unfair in private, but she really tried to listen to people and take different viewpoints into account. And then she made a decision and moved on. And she was a good leader in many ways. And I think she did a lot of work to heal the college.
So the 80s really was really quite a challenge. The economic challenges were significant, and the strife that caused among the staff must have been, it apparently really has a lasting impact on our college and our culture.
It really does. And then, you get a scared board that overcorrects, and somebody who's financially responsible and puts us on solid footing financially becomes godlike and cannot be questioned. I mean, so you see, the history has an impact.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much for taking us through the 1980s and the 1990s. We move the history of the college really moves into the 2000s with the appointment of Steve Kinsella as our president. In our next podcast, we'll be talking about the methodologies that you used to create your history. I'm looking forward to that conversation.
So am I, and I really want to give a shout out to Grant Richards, who has come early in the morning to do extra work on top of all the work he already does to make these podcasts possible. So I really appreciate it.
Grant's a star. Thank you, Grant.